Nikola Jokic is the greatest NBA draft pick of all time. In terms of where you get selected and the value you provide to your team, it's not particularly close. It's not even what the video is about necessarily. Like, that is established. There's no real debate. If Jokic didn't exist, then the conversation would come down to either Steve Nash or Giannis Antetokounmpo, both of which prior to Jokic were the latest drafted MVPs in league history, both getting selected 15th overall. Personally, I would take Giannis, but because Jokic exists, it's not close. The 41st pick in the draft is a back-to-back MVP and a guy that could potentially win a third straight MVP this season, which is unprecedented. Only a couple of guys in the history of the league have done that. And the concept of this video more so is like, how does this happen? We talk all the time about the draft on this channel. We talk about value. We talk about, late round steals, guys that are going to do well in the draft. How do you get to the 41st pick in the draft and become potentially a three-time MVP? Now, the first and most obvious part of this is, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but Nikola Jokic doesn't exactly look or play like what you would expect a big-time NBA player to play like or look like. You can go back and look at any scouting report for him as a potential second round pick at the time, and everybody saw him as this like slow international guy that had some skill, but we've seen plenty of those guys come into the league and just be bench players or not make it in the league at all, and a lack of quickness and a lack of defensive impact were certainly concerns for Jokic. And what we didn't account for enough as evaluators at the time was the way that the league was starting to shift at the time that he came into the NBA, to where, you still need to be a good athlete, you still need to be able to move your feet, but the way that Jokic plays, and specifically how skillfully he plays, was something that was incredibly underestimated at the time. But even if we knew what the league was going to look like and how Jokic would fit into it, I still don't know that he would have gotten drafted all that much higher, because not even the Denver Nuggets, the team that actually picked Jokic, thought that he was even close to this good. Like, you can, make the case that Denver did an awesome job of picking him where they did, getting great value, but not even they thought that he would be probably even all-star caliber player, because they had two first-round picks in this draft, and they came away with Yusuf Nurkic, who we're going to talk about later, and Gary Harris, both of which are fine NBA players, but not a potential three-time MVP in Nikola Jokic with the 41st pick in the draft. The second part of this certainly is the international stuff. At this point, when Jokic came into the league in the mid-2010s, we still were a little bit uncertain about what to do with these international prospects, because guys would get drafted high and not do particularly well. This is before Luka would show up, and so the ceiling outside of guys like, Dirk, Pau Gasol earlier in the century, we didn't really have that much of a track record of these guys becoming like top tier players the way that we have, international players now, guys like Jokic and Luka and Giannis, all these different guys largely dominating the league. The landscape was just different in terms of the draft. But again, even if you kind of eliminate some of that stuff and some of the athleticism concerns, Jokic was just not seen as a very good prospect, at least certainly in terms of like being a first round player. And his development, I think, really speaks to where he got to and how he got there more than anything else. And I spoke earlier about how not even Denver knew, how good Jokic was. And that is another interesting theme of this that I don't really think ever gets talked about, because Jokic is very happy in Denver. He's pretty much always seemingly had a good experience there, but even they doubted him plenty along the way. And I think that's been kind of a theme of his career, as players or, other teams doubting Jokic, doubting his development, because even, as early as a couple years into his career, Denver was not certain that he was their long-term guy. They, as I mentioned earlier, had Yusuf Nurkic on the roster, who in his own right was a pretty good player, and they tried to play those two guys together. Ultimately just didn't work, and they traded away Nurkic to prioritize Jokic. But there was a real conversation in the year plus leading up to that trade about what they should do, who they should prioritize. And even once they, or prior to making the trade, there was a lot of shifting back and forth, and they wouldn't fully commit. And the current coach Michael Malone, who obviously loves Jokic now, wouldn't commit to him as the full-time five and him as the cornerstone of the franchise for a lot of different reasons. Certainly he wasn't as good then as he is now, but even the team that ended up with him in the second round wasn't sure if they should pick him or Yusuf Nurkic, who again, no disrespect to him, but he's not nearly on the same level as Jokic is to this point in his career. And I think that's an interesting theme here, and not just that everybody else doubted Jokic, but that even Denver did as well. And then once they fully committed to him as the full-time starter, he really started to flourish. But that certainly wasn't the end of the doubts around Jokic's game, because then the conversation became like, is this guy going to be able to guard? Like, you can talk about MVP caliber this and offense that, but like, is he going to be able to guard? Is he going to be able to, do some things for you in the postseason in terms of defending pick and rolls? Like, the game being more spread out helps him offensively, but can he defend as well? And I mean, it was a huge issue. He's like the worst big man defender in the entire league for a couple of years there in Denver. And he, just like everything else, he has fixed that. Like, oh, you're worried about his athleticism? Okay, well, he's big, he's strong, he's got long arms, he's got all this skill. That fixes that. Oh, you're worried about him being able to guard? Okay, well, we'll play drop coverage. He'll be really smart. He'll use his length. He'll be an okay rim protector. He's never going to be, what Joel Embiid is or what Giannis is as a defender, but he's, good enough to the point where he's not hurting you, to the point where they are better when he's out there, certainly offensively, but then defensively as well, has become a pretty critical piece for them. And that's especially important for a big guy. We've seen a ton of perimeter players over the years in the league that are not very good defenders. You can hide those guys a little bit, but if you're a big and you can't guard a pick and roll, you can't guard a ball screen, teams are going to run that every single time down the floor. And it almost doesn't matter how good you are offensively, you're going to give up layups or open threes every single time down the floor. His development defensively is critical to him becoming an MVP caliber player. Despite how good he is offensively, that stuff needed to change, and it did. And that is how you get to where Jokic has gotten to as the 41st pick in the draft. You continue to develop, you work on stuff, and you just have a little bit of patience, a little bit of faith in him, as Denver ultimately did. And of course, that has been paid off times 1,000. And I think it's really interesting how he fits into this era, because a lot of what you think about with the past, 10 or so years in the league in terms of the actual play style is a lot of ball screen stuff, spread the floor, lots of threes. And Jokic, he does that stuff, right? Like he spaces the floor, and, you can have him as a guy setting the screen. He can even, run some pick and roll himself. But the way that he plays is different than anybody else. The way that Denver plays is different than anybody else. He holds the ball less than any other star player in the league. He creates more in different ways and on different spots on the floor than any other player in the league. You don't need to just have him, set a screen or have a screen set for him at the top of the key. He can work from the elbows, he can work from the post. It allows for all this movement, and he is, I would argue, probably the most fun player in the league right now to play with. And again, that's just an incredible, ascension for him from the 41st pick in the draft. And that's why I really don't think it's a debate. Maybe someone down in the comment section below can come up with this narrative and this whole novel about how, it should be a debate, and he's not necessarily the greatest draft pick of all time because of this guy or this undrafted player, whatever the case may be. But for him to drop to 41st is completely unprecedented, which leads to the MVP stuff this year and the debate that's going to continue to happen throughout the rest of the season. Like, should he win his third straight? Should he not win his third straight? Some people, question whether he should have won the previous two MVPs over guys like Giannis, and, maybe you want to make the case for LeBron or Embiid or whatever the case may be. Here's my thing about the MVP and Jokic. Historically, I would rather the MVP be an indicator of who the best guy, the most valuable guy was in a particular season, rather than a narrative-based award. Because the thing that you want to, look back on and understand about a season when you see a player as the MVP is like, who was the best guy? Who was the most impactful? Who was the most valuable to their team? And so even if that means that LeBron, wins 6 MVPs out of 8 years, as maybe he should have, in the true prime of his career, that's still a better indication of what that season looked like, what that season meant, and who the most important guy was. Whereas more often it becomes this narrative-based award, and it's like, oh, this guy's up and coming, right? Like, this guy has improved the most, or this guy, maybe means the most to his city, whatever the case may be. Like, for example, the Derrick Rose MVP is one that certainly comes into question, maybe feels a little bit more narrative-based. And I just want the guy that deserves it the most to win the award. I don't care if they won the previous 2. I don't care if they've won 4 out of the last 5. I don't care about that. And I think Nikola Jokic has as strong of an argument as any other player in the league right now, and will continue to have as strong of an argument as anyone else, potentially stronger, to win the MVP. The advanced numbers are what they are about him. Denver's going to have a great record. He's going to be a really impactful player. On the offensive end of the floor, he's going to be the best guy in the league to play alongside. And I just don't see how you can make an argument against him as MVP. Maybe you want to prop someone else up, like Embiid or Luka, whatever the case may be, and, make a positive argument about those guys. But to try and bring Jokic down doesn't make any sense to me. And that's just always kind of how I've been about the MVP, is it should be the best guy, it should be the most impactful guy. But the problem is voter fatigue continues to come into play here. I think it's one of the reasons why Giannis doesn't really get considered for MVPs anymore. I think it's one of the reasons why maybe Kevin Durant won't get considered as much this season because of, what happened this offseason, requesting a trade. There's all these different narratives that come into it. And I would much rather, similar to the All-NBA stuff and the All-Star stuff, like you can look back on All-NBA and All-Star stuff and for the most part understand who the best guys in the league were and who made the biggest impact on the league in those particular seasons. And I'd much rather that be an indicator historically of what happened in those seasons. And same thing with the MVP, rather than this story that we were all following at the time that maybe, 15, 20 years from that point down the line doesn't seem nearly as impactful. And in terms of Jokic in the draft, we're always going to have big time draft steals for a variety of reasons. I've talked about this in other videos. It's so difficult to evaluate these guys and think about what they're going to become in, 10 years or whatever the case may be. When you're bringing guys into the league at 18, 19, they're probably going to start coming into the league even younger, potentially at a high school here coming up pretty soon as well. And they're always going to have those kinds of steals. You're going to have a Tyrese Maxey in the 20s, or you're going to have maybe Giannis going 15th in terms of a guy that really just develops in an incredible way. But with a league that's generally getting better at identifying talent and using talent in a proper way, the combination of all those factors with Jokic in terms of, what he looked like, where he was coming from, how the league was going to shift in his favor in, the years that since he had entered the league, and obviously the incredible development and the skills that he possessed at that size, I can't imagine we're ever gonna see a player drafted this late become this great ever again. And I think it's pretty easy to just go ahead and write down in pen for like the rest of history that Nikola Jokic is the greatest NBA draft pick of all time, and it's not particularly close.